the life of a working actor is an interesting one. And as I'll talk about with tonight's guest, who we'll introduce momentarily, you grow up and not everybody is a household name per se. Not everybody is a Brad Pitt or a Lindsay Lohan, a Angelina Jolie, so on and so forth. But if a working actor, and the beauty of a versatile working actor at that is that you see them in so many different things across the years. They're never synonymous with one thing. And you constantly find yourself saying, I know that guy or I know that girl. That's really the case with tonight's guest. He's been in Law and Order. He's been in Third Watch. I've seen him in so many other programs. And I'm like, yeah, and finally we connected on social media not too long ago. And it's been a long time coming to get him on the show. So I'll introduce him in a moment. And on that note, we welcome you to episode 347 of the Mike to New Haven podcast. Very much appreciate having all of you tuning in via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook, of course. If you have not checked out the previous episode, that was definitely a lot of fun to do. Certainly glad we did it. And that was with John Fleming. John Fleming, a former detective in the Office of Special Narcotics. A different show, but a nice show in that, as I mentioned, the promo for it, we normally don't get a glimpse at law enforcement agencies like that in the city. So we may know they're around, but we may not know their exact function. And John came on, did a really good job of explaining what that office does and his 29-year career in that office. So very good episode with him. I mentioned this on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram as well. And we begin the show tonight, unfortunately, on a very somber note. And I wanted to pay tribute to my friend who's been on this show multiple times, was a great guest on the show and a great friend off the air. And that's Miles' Sonn. You may remember Miles, met posts from our mutual friend, Lorenzo Toledo. He retired out of U.S. Customs, came on couple years ago to tell his story about being in Border Patrol first, then U.S. Customs, came back not too long ago with Alex Alonso to talk about a unique undercover narcotics operation they did called Operation Overlord in the early 90s. And Miles, and I felt this way about him at the time. I'm not just saying this now because he's sadly gone. He lived a million lives in one, which is what makes his sudden death so tragic in that Border Patrol, U.S. Customs, undercover, not just here domestically on dangerous assignments and investigations, but abroad as well. And tragically, Miles died suddenly, like I said, this past weekend from medical complications. He was 68, and this was a man who was a healthy 68-year-old. He did everything right. This was a guy who was healthier than some 30 and 40-year-olds that you know. In the gym every day, worked out all the time, ate right, did everything right, but experienced medical complications that cut his life way, way too short. And as I mentioned, when I paid tribute to him on social media, it was an honor to know him. It was an honor to hear his stories, an honor to be his friend. He was a good man, always good for a laugh, always upbeat and positive. We had literally talked the day before. He was always sending me funny things on social media that had me cracking up. And he was just a good person, and there's people you cross paths with when you do something like journalism that really make you glad that you do it. And he was one of them. So I'm very sad that he's gone. I still can't believe it. It hasn't really sunk in that he's not with us anymore, and that I'm not going to get a text from him with something funny or some great photo from the past cases that he worked, or that I'm not going to get him sending something funny to me on Instagram. It doesn't feel real, but I want to send my deepest condolences on not just on my behalf, but also producer Victor's behalf to Miles' family. He was a great man, as I'm sure many people have told you, a wonderful man, a wonderful spirit he had, wonderful positivity and personality, and he will not be forgotten. And I'm very glad that I got the chance to know him, and I will miss him very, very much. We'll play a couple of sponsors, and we'll introduce tonight's guest.
Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guide? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast.
My next guest had two dual lives, as I mentioned in the beginning. Police officer for several years, retired at the rank of captain after 24 years, and then working actor during that time. So for his time until he, of course, retired in 1992, he was juggling both. And it's funny because I always saw him in different law enforcement procedural dramas, mainly Law and Order, where I thought to myself, he plays a cop really well. Turns out the reason why he plays a cop so well is because he was one. So he understands exactly how to play one. He lived it for 24 years, 17th Precinct commanding officer for a time, 12 years in different narcotic unit assignments, of which he'll tell me about tonight. And of course, has appeared in many different programs, including Third Watch and Law and Order, as we mentioned. You may know him from other programs as well. And that for this episode 347 of the Mike to New Haven podcast, retired NYPD captain, Joe Lisi. Joe, welcome. How are you?
Yeah, very well, Mike. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, thanks for being here. So before we get, of course, into your career in the law enforcement side and later on acting, you're a true New Yorker. Tell me about where you grew up and what inspired you, if at all early on, into a career in civil service.
Well, I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Queens. And growing up, I loved the television show called The Untouchables. And The Untouchables starred Robert Stack as Elliot Ness. And as you know, Elliot Ness was the guy who chased Al Capone. Now, in my neighborhood, which was a lower middle class neighborhood, the kids on the street, all of my friends always wanted to be Al Capone playing gangsters. I wanted to be Elliot Ness. So I think that had something to do with the reason why I became a cop. And also the exposure that I had as a young kid on the street with the New York City cops. It was always very positive, even when they were taking our gloves and stickball bats because the people were complaining of us playing stickball in the street. They would tell us, meet us around the corner. And we'd go around the corner and the cops would give us everything back. So I always had good experiences, and I love people. I like to help people, so that's why I do.
And you came on in 68, which is interesting because that's kind of a crossroads for the city. It was the end of innocence, if you will, for the city. The city had gone through really good 50s and 60s. Late 60s into the early 70s, that's when the pendulum starts to swing the other way and things start to go bad. So cops are busy during this time. You have a lot of assassinations going on because of the Weather Underground, the FALN. So it's not an easy time. So coming on then in 68, going into the 70s, tell me about those early years and where you first ended up out of the academy.
Okay, well, I graduated from high school in June of 1968. I was 17 years old, and I had taken the test to become a police trainee. So I was hired by the police department in August of 1968 as a police trainee. And I spent 3 years as a trainee prior to getting my shield and my gun and becoming a cop. So as a police trainee, you worked in administrative positions, either in a police station or at an office at headquarters. So you had all the exposure to the cops, but you didn't actually go out and enforce the law. I even went through the police academy as a trainee. We did all the training exactly as the recruit officers, with the exception of firearms. When we were 21, you reached the 21st birthday, you had to go back to the academy for 2 weeks of firearms training, and then you were out into a precinct.
What's interesting is that it was kind of the reverse with you. Usually some people have a military career prior to law enforcement or prior to the fire service, then they go into the academy. You had some training, of course, as a police trainee, as you just mentioned, and then came the Marine Corps a year later in 1969. So tell me about the decision to go into the Corps.
Well, I had to get permission from the police commissioner to go on military leave to join the Marine Corps. And what I did was I enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. And the reason why I did that was because when I was a young police trainee, there was a guy who came to work in our office. His name was John Devine. He was a civilian, a police administrative aide. And a long story short, this young man was terrific. He was a born leader. He never complained about anything. He worked around the clock. He had one leg. So what happened was we would see him working around, and of course he was, you know, he had a prosthesis leg, and I knew that he was a veteran. And then ultimately I found out he was a Marine. And what happened was he went to Vietnam, and very early on in Vietnam, he lost his leg. And of course he then was medically discharged. But he was such an unbelievable young man, a born leader, a team player, a goal-oriented person, didn't complain about, you know, the fact that he was now severely handicapped. He just was somebody you would look up to. And even though I was only a teenager and he was maybe a year older than me, I looked up to him. And I said, I want to be like that guy. I want to be a Marine. And that's what I did.
Harris Island is no joke. It's the proving grounds, as anybody that's ever heard about the Corps, or like in your case, been in the Corps, knows. They break you down to build you up, is what I've heard. So tell me about the mental toughness that you had to build up undergoing such rigorous training.
Well, the training back then, of course, was only 8 weeks long because we were in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Right.
So they had to condense what was normally 12 weeks of training into 8 weeks of training. So, as you say, it was very intense. And I remember when I first met my senior drill instructor, he said to me, he got into my face and he said, there are 3 things we don't like here. New Yorkers, Italians, and reservists. And of course, I was all 3. So, needless to say, I wanted to, it was tough. And back then, the drill instructors were a lot more physical than they are today for the recruits. So it was quite an 8 weeks. But once you earn the title Marine, it's something you never give up. You live it for the rest of your life. And looking back on it, you're glad that you did it.
You had Camp Lejeune as well in radio school. Now, for those not familiar with that process, most people know Camp Lejeune, but the radio school, what exactly did that entail?
Well, my MOS, which is Military Occupation Specialty, was 2532, which is a radio relay operator. Now, of course, today, with everything being wireless and all that, the radio systems are much different. But back then, a field radio operator carried a very heavy pack with a radio and a very long antenna, and his job was to be next to the platoon leader, who was usually a lieutenant. So in a combat situation, first person they look to shoot is the radio guy and the guy next to him, who's obviously the lieutenant. So my job as a radio relay operator was to set up powers where we would send signals to those radios. And you're not actually directly on the front lines, but you're pretty close. And so the radio school was, I think, 6 or 8 weeks in a very famous part of Camp Lejeune, which at one point was called Montford Point, which is where they trained the original African American Marines when the Corps was still segregated in 1942. So it was very historic to be somebody that was living in those quarters where those original Black Marines stayed.
Again, it's intensive because in something like this, you have to be tactically sound, you have to be sharp, and you have to be quick. But I feel like going through that training not only prepared you well naturally for that assignment, but probably your police career too later on.
Oh, without a doubt. Interestingly enough, because my time on active duty was very short, because the reservist obligation is you do your boot camp, you do your military school, and then when 6 months are over, you leave active duty and you go to your reserve unit. So when I went back to my reserve unit, I went back on active duty in the police department. I was sent to the same police unit, and I worked for the same police supervisor. And I'll never forget that the sergeant that I worked for told me when I had gone away, before I went away, I was kind of like a wise ass, not too very disciplined, and he didn't really have a lot of hope or faith in me. And he said that when I came back, I was like a different person. And I became more like John Devine, who I wanted to emulate, team player, hopefully a leader, things like that. So the change it's drastic, it's fast, and it's permanent.
Absolutely. Talking with Joe Lisi here on the Mike and Raven podcast, retired NYPD captain again. As you guys know in the chat, if you have a question, submit it and I'll highlight it at the appropriate time. With that in mind, patrol, how long were you on it? And once you went through the firearms training, where were you first assigned? Did they have NSU in the 70s back then?
No.
Was that more
No,
based? Okay.
No, they didn't have it. So after I did my 2 weeks at the police academy and got my qualifications to carry a firearm, I was sent to the 88th precinct, which is in Fort Greene and the edge of Bed-Stuy. And of course, that was in 1971. So those were tough times back then. Yeah. And what I remember most about that, I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood. And when I was assigned to the precinct as a kid who grew up in Queens, the thing that I noticed the most about that neighborhood was how many working age adult men were in the street during the day. Because where I grew up, there were very few men. We didn't see men during the daytime at all because they were working. The people that I were policed in Brooklyn back then, a lot of them were not working for a lot of different reasons. Unemployment, drugs, alcohol, discrimination on some level. So it was a different world. So it was really kind of like a culture shock thing for me. And that was one of the things that I took away from that early on.
Bed-Stuy has a nickname, do or die Bed-Stuy. That's for very good reason. It's a tough place to work. A lot of good people working there, but a lot of tough characters too. And you got to prove yourself early on because unfortunately, what are these tough guys looking to do? Well, they're looking to test you early on. And that's where the discipline comes in. Of course, you had your prior training. They didn't know your background, but you know your background. But there's that delicate balancing act that a police officer has to walk between compassion for the community and knowing when to be firm and stand your ground. So tell me about instances early on where there were some tough collars, and if there were, any tough confrontations you might have had early on.
Well, I will tell you this, and I'm glad you mentioned that. What people forget very often is in those poor, underprivileged neighborhoods are so many good, hardworking people that just want to raise a family, protect their children, provide for them, and live a life free of, crime. They want to live a safe life like everybody else wants to do. So that's being able to do that or provide some degree of that in a neighborhood like where I worked back then. That was very satisfying as a cop. But the very first assignment I ever went on, which was the first week there, they put you in the car and you're the third man in a radio car. They didn't have energy. So they would put you in a car with two seasoned cops. And it was an 8-to-4 tour. And we turned out after the roll call with the sergeant giving you all the assignments. We turned out and we drove to a deli. And we got 3 containers of coffee. And part of the precinct had some factories. We went by a factory. And I'm a rookie cop. You just sit in the back and you do what the cops tell you to do. So we're starting to sip the coffee, and over the radio, the first radio assignment I ever went to, shots fired in the 88th precinct. Who's responding? So the two cops automatically throw their cups out of the windows of the car, and the car takes off. Now, I'm a cop. I got a gun. I got a shield. And I'm going to a gun battle right now. But I feel like I'm still a civilian because I've never done this before. And these two guys, they were taking it in stride. Anyway, we got there, everything was over, but there had been a shooting involved. And that was the very first radio assignment I ever went on. And it went downhill from there. There are times when if you were working a 4 to 12 shift, you would get into your car, and at the beginning of your tour, the radio dispatcher would tell you that they're holding 24 jobs just in your sector. That's how busy it was back then in the 70s.
You learn to really roll with the punches in a command like that because at the end of the day, you're needed. Not only do your fellow officers need you, but obviously the community as well. When it comes to comfort level in the neighborhood, it's a culture shock for a lot of guys because, I mean, in some instances, not so much because they grew up around neighborhoods like that, if not in that same neighborhood, so they know it well. Other guys are coming in from different parts of the city, maybe even Long Island or Westchester, never really been in environments like that before, so it's tough to assimilate. For you, even as a city kid, tell me about navigating that and when you first felt comfortable in the beat and felt that you really had a stake in the community.
Well, it takes a while to build up that confidence and to feel like you have a stake. Because in the beginning, you feel like an outsider and you don't necessarily belong. And then what you also have to do is you have to earn your way into the brother and sisterhood of the fraternity of the precinct. And as a new guy, you or a new officer, today it's man or woman, you very often get the unpleasant assignment. Okay? So also in that very first week, I'll give you an example. I get called into the police station and they tell me I have to go to Cumberland Hospital to take care of a psycho, to watch a psycho. Today they call them emotionally disturbed people.
Yes.
In my day, they called them psychos because you know what? That's what they were.
Yeah.
So we go in there and the cops, once again, it's like the cops that threw the coffee out of the cup. They're experienced guys. They take everything in stride. Me, they don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. So they take me down to Cumberland Hospital, and the two cops are going to let me go into the room to see the person that I'm going to be escorting from Cumberland Hospital to Brooklyn Hospital, where they had a bigger psych ward. So they kind of let me go in the room by myself, and I could see that they were, I knew they weren't afraid, but I think they were giving me a little razz. So I go in the room, and there's this woman who looked like my grandmother. She was about, I don't know, maybe 5 feet tall, and she was in like a hospital gown, and she was squatting down, and she was urinating and defecating on the floor of the room. Okay, so she sees me, and now she attacks me. So now I'm tussling with this 4'9" or 5 foot young woman in a hospital gown, and I'm rolling in my uniform in the urine and the feces with her. We're rolling around, and the cops are laughing because they're not going to let me get hurt, but they're going to let me get a baptism of fire, so to speak. So then I had to take her out. An old nurse helped me. They helped clean me up, but I still had to take her with my soiled uniform to Kings County Hospital where the person got the help that she needed. But that's the kind of stuff they have.
And I tell you, they don't pay cops enough to deal with that.
No.
They don't. And that's the thing. I mean, oftentimes, and it's a much more complicated discussion that is for a different day, but oftentimes, for a variety of reasons, the first point of contact with an EDP is both police and EMS. So
Exactly.
I know a lot of people wonder, well, why are cops handling emotionally disturbed people runs? Because oftentimes they're the only ones available to respond to them.
That's right.
And it's not easy. You want the person to get the help they need, but there's a lot of that has to go with that process. And sometimes it's rolling around stuff like that.
And listen, we can put this all into perspective too. Back then, when I became a police trainee, my salary was $4,000 a year. Wow. And then I graduated. When you become a rookie cop, I believe we were making maybe $18,000 a year. So it wasn't a lot of money for doing a lot of work. A good job.
Right, and that's the thing, and that's not to say it doesn't exist today. It certainly still does. But guys of your era back then, they were really doing it for love of the job. Because if you wanted to get into a profession for money, that was not the profession to get into. You really had to want to do it. You really wanted to help people.
Yeah, we used to say it was really like a vocation,
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't do it for the money. It's not worth it. No matter how much they pay you, it's not worth it. You really have to do it because you want to either help people or there's something about you where you want to be looked up to, I guess, or whatever. Because in your makeup, you're the white knight that is supposed to be there to help people. And that's the best part of being a cop because you meet all different kinds of people in all different kinds of situations, and you get to help an awful lot of good people. And then you get to arrest some bad people. So it's always about dun dun dun, going to the job with the sirens and the camaraderie and the operational execution of it. It's a great job. I hope it's still, they say it's not as great as it was. The cops that I worked with were all really wonderful people. Many of them were military veterans themselves. I mean, when I was a rookie, some of the old guys had been in World War II and they were still on the job.
That's right.
So, these were guys that fought on Iwo Jima and then are walking a beat in Bed-Stuy. So it was great. It was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Joe Maliga with the question in the chat. On that beat, you ever deliver a baby?
I did, as a matter of fact.
All right.
And as they told us in the police academy, you had to be like a center and allow the baby to come out. and that's all we could do. And this was in a tenement apartment. It was a young girl, and I guess I don't even know if she knew she was pregnant. You hear these stories where they don't know until the time they're about to give birth. And it was just me and my partner. The baby came. We put it on the mother's belly with a towel. Don't touch the umbilical cord. Call for the bus. Off to the hospital.
There you go. Simple, to the point, concise, step by step, and all was well.
Yeah, and then go get lunch.
You get home and your wife asks you how was work. Well, let's ho-hum day at the office. A couple calls here and there, deliver the baby. Otherwise, nothing major.
Well, very often the cops can't tell their family really about a lot of what they experience because, to us, we do it and we can commiserate with our fellow officers, but you don't want to bring a lot of the bad stuff home because and that's another thing, cops. I saw in the opening credits you had Jack Cambria on. That's one of the things, the cops carry a lot of burden mentally upstairs, and they need to be very grounded human beings to be able to handle such a difficult job because that's part of the job that is very, very taxing. And if you can't handle it, the way I used to say, it was important to kind of divorce yourself emotionally from the job. You can't take things personally when people, would say things to you, but of course it was different then. You could curse me out. You could call me an MF. You could say whatever you wanted to do. That was fine. But the minute you touched me, and when I say me, I'm talking about any other cop that worked at the time that I worked. You touched me, you went down. That's it. Boom. No questions asked. That's the way it was. Today, not like that. You saw that disgrace when they took those two officers and threw the water over them.
Yeah.
If I had been the duty captain that day, I would have suspended both those cops. I would have suspended both of them for not taking any action. And the reason why I would have suspended them was they made the job of policing more difficult for every other cop that's still in the city. Because you can't allow people to do that to you and not do anything about it. Because that just foments, and then they start doing more and more, and eventually they take out guns and they shoot the cops. Can't let people get away with it.
And I'll do you one better. And he's been on the show. He's a friend as well. They better be thankful they didn't do that when Louis Animone was still around. Because if Louis Animone was a duty captain, everybody in that block would have gotten rounded up that day. The whole block would have gotten shut down.
Well, listen, one of my last assignments before I retired was the riots in Crown Heights. Mm-hmm. And Louis Animone was the chief of department back then. I know him well because I knew him from when he was a lieutenant. He's also in your opening credits, I noticed. Mm-hmm. And Ray Kelly was the commissioner, and he handpicked a bunch of captains to go to Crown Heights to augment the policing in the 71st Precinct. We had a bunch of cops there. And for whatever reason, they picked me. I was one of the captains that was sent there. And I can remember being out in the street with Louis Animone, Chief Animone, of course, and we were moving people around. And you're right what you said. We didn't take guff from anybody. We were always respectful, but we were in charge. And we had to clean the street. We cleaned the street. Cleaned it up. Louis was a good man.
Absolutely. He's still going strong. He's definitely still going strong. As far as the rank ascension is concerned, considering where you finished up rank wise, tell me about the studying aspect. Did you know early on? Because some guys, they know early on, yeah, I'd eventually like to be a boss in the job one day. Other guys, as time progresses, they're like, you know what? I'll give it a shot. What was your mentality towards that? When did you start thinking about, we'll start with Sergeant?
Well, first of all, I only wanted to be a detective. It's all I wanted to be was a detective. And believe it or not, even though I had 8 years in an investigative assignment, I never became a detective. Because back then, with the fiscal crisis and everything, when I went into narcotics, for example, there were 75 cops in Manhattan South Narcotics and maybe 3 detectives. The rest of them were all white shield guys and women. So I started to study because I wanted to make more money. And back then, a sergeant, I believe, a detective made 15% more than a cop. A sergeant made 30% more than a cop. A lieutenant made 50% more than a cop. And a captain made 100% more than a cop. So I studied, and I studied a lot. I failed the first sergeant test that I took. And when I came to study for the second time around, I went to 3 promotional schools. I did private tutoring because I have a thick head. They got to bang it into me, you know. And then I was able to get through, and I got promoted. But being a sergeant, I'm going off on a tangent. But being a sergeant is the most important rank in the police department. And it's because you are the first line supervisor. And when people ask me, what's it like to be a sergeant? I say, listen, I can tell you the difference between being a cop and a sergeant in a couple of sentences. And this is it. What is funny to the cops is not funny to the sergeant. When you pull up on it, I don't know if you get that, but when you pull up on an incident, whatever's going on, very often cops see the humor in it. But as the sergeant, you can't see the humor in it because you got to make sure that things get done. So the cops understand when I say that, they know exactly what I mean. But the sergeant sets the tone. He sets the tone for the platoon. He's the patrol supervisor or she. And it's such an important rank. The sergeant has more of an impact on the cop than the captain, certainly than the chiefs and the borough commanders. That's why it's so very important to have good first line supervisors.
Absolutely.
But where a lot of them go wrong, they want to be the cop's friend and a boss at the same time, which you can't really do. I'm not saying you have to alienate yourself from the troops, but you have to set a little bit of a zone, a little bit of a separation between you and the cops that you work with, because there's going to come a time when you're going to have to disappoint them or tell them that they can't do something, and you have to have that separation so that you can do it with a clear conscience and a firm hand, for lack of a better term.
Right. And oftentimes, the sergeant, much like a lieutenant in a fire department, and the sergeant of police department is your first point of contact as an authority figure. Now, are there people above him or her? Yes, as you just mentioned. But like you said, they set the tone. And the sergeant, and this is no knock on lieutenants rather, or captains, both ranks which you held, and we'll talk about those as we go. The sergeant's still getting dirty, so to speak, because they're out there on the streets with the men and women, more so to the degree than a lieutenant or a captain is. So therefore, there's a better understanding of what they're going through. But with that better understanding, all the more need, as you said, to set that tone.
Well, you're absolutely right about that. And you also drew a comparison between a police sergeant and a fire lieutenant. Now, a fire lieutenant is, of course, the first supervisory rank in the fire department. And while I have tremendous respect for a firefighter, there's a big difference between cops on patrol and firefighters. And here's the difference. Cops on patrol operate and make decisions and have to exercise judgment on their own. And then after they make a decision and after they exercise judgment, then they very often have to call the sergeant to the scene and discuss what happened and what's going on after that. In the fire department, the way firefighting is, it's a team thing, but the fire team goes in with the lieutenant and they don't do anything that the lieutenant doesn't tell them to do. So the fire department exercise, the fire operation, the fire supervisor says, let's get the hose, you go this way, go that way. they're told what to do every step of the way. The big difference between a cop and a firefighter is a cop has to exercise their own judgment, and they have to make the decisions without having the supervisor present. And then they have to stand by those decisions, because if they make the wrong decision, of course, especially in an environment like today, it could be very costly for them.
Right. I think that's fair. I think it's a good comp. And that's why the role of patrol officer is so tough. It's always been tough, but it's especially tough these days for those reasons that you mentioned, because you can't take those decisions back. And the sergeant can help and your partner can help, but oftentimes, even if it's a good decision, it's one that gets dissected and analyzed over and over and over, especially now with body cam being able to review it. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that goes on after the fact. So that's a pretty fair comparison there. And I'll ask you, in line with that, was there an incident, and I'm sure there was, but was there an incident, I'll ask you anyway, early on as a sergeant, where you finally felt, okay, I feel like I'm a boss now. I think I handled that really well.
No, that's a tough question. When I made sergeant, I was in the narcotics division, and because I was in a very specialized unit, they decided it was better for the police department to keep me in that unit as opposed to sending me back to patrol as a first line supervisor on patrol. So when I made sergeant, I stayed in the narcotics division. So the challenge for me was, not only did I stay in the narcotics division, I stayed in the same unit that I had been assigned to, which was called the Special Projects Unit. We did all the audio and video surveillance for all the drug operations and for the feds and all that. But here's the thing. I went from being the junior man and the youngest person in the unit to becoming one of the bosses. So the guys that used to be telling me what to do, now I'm not telling them what to do, but I got to get them to do what needs to be done. So that was a bit of a challenge, but I think I was able to handle it okay, because what you learn in the Marine Corps is it's all about your Marines. So it then becomes all about your cops. Your job is to take care of your cops, assist them in any way that you can to have them get the job done, and then to be there for them when they need resources or anything else. You don't do the job, they do it. You're there to support them. So whatever the Marines need, that's what the Marine officers are there for. Whatever the cops need, that's what the supervisors are there for.
Once again, well said. We're talking with Joe Lisi, retired NYPD captain, of course, longtime actor, here in the Mike and Raven podcast. I'll touch on narcotics in a moment, because that was the bulk of your career, 12 years, as a matter of fact. But around this time, I believe, is when you start to dabble, if you will, in the acting realm. Tell me about deciding to do that. I mean, you have a stable career. It's advancing well. It's going well. And oftentimes in any profession, people aren't comfortable stepping outside what they know and stepping outside their comfort zone. You did. Did you have a prior background in acting?
I did not. It was something, though, that I always wanted to do. When people ask me, what did you want to do? I said, there's two things in my life I wanted to be. I wanted to be a New York City cop, and I wanted to be an actor. And then I tell them, once I became a Marine, I knew I could do anything. So I actually took my first acting lesson when I was 29 years old, but at that time I had already been off patrol and in the narcotics division. Mm-hmm. So, but before I took my acting lesson, when I was still in the precinct, I was in the anti-crime unit in the 8-8 in Brooklyn. I lived in Queens at the time, and I saw in the local newspaper they were having a community theater group was having auditions for the play Arsenic and Old Lace. I don't know if you know the play at all, but I decided I wanted to go. I didn't even know how to audition, but I wanted to go, and I went down there and I tried out to get into this play. Now, the play it's an old comedy, but there were two police roles in the play. Now, I didn't tell the people that I was auditioning for that I was a cop. I just was somebody from the community that wanted to try out to be in the play. And believe it or not, lo and behold, they cast me in the play as Officer Brokey, one of the cops in the play. Well, I didn't know how to work. I didn't know anything about acting, but I knew I wanted to do it, and I had so much fun that my wife at the time told me, if you want to be an actor, go and learn how to be an actor. So based on that, that's when I began to study. And the first place I studied at was in Greenwich Village, a place called HT Studio, which was a good place to pick up, like, I guess you would call it basic training. And I studied there for 3 years before I even tried to get a job. But then after that, I went on and I studied with Stella Adler, who's a very famous acting teacher. And then I took a 2-year master's program at Phil Esper, who came from the neighborhood playhouse. So, and that's where I met Bruce Altman. We talked about him off camera, about
Yes.
that you're a New Haven guy.
Yeah.
And that's where I met Bruce. So that's how that all evolved for me.
Anthony Lisi, former sergeant in the NYPD Emergency Service Unit, sends his regards. He's watched the night. Shares the same last name. Is you guys related?
Hey, what do you think? Of course we're related. You know, it's funny. He's technically my cousin's son, but in the police department, he was always my nephew, because it's too, you know how Italians are. It's too crazy to kind of explain anything. Yeah. So, and I'm so proud of him. He was such a terrific cop, and I watched his career bloom. He's a better cop than me and his father will ever have been. He was the real deal, and so happy that he's even watching the program. But I have a lot of respect for him. He's great, terrific cop.
Absolutely. He was on the show a number of years ago for my ESU miniseries. He's one of the first guests I had for that miniseries some time ago. And yeah, 5 truck in emergency, 6 truck as well. Had the distinction of being a cop and a boss in emergency service. So glad to see you, Tony. Hope all's well in your neck of the woods these days.
Well, of course,
go ahead.
I was going to say I have an affinity for Truck One because I was involved in a television show, which was called True Blue, which was about Truck One. And, you know, the one thing I would give Anthony a hard time about is because, you know, you're not a cop unless you're a cop in Manhattan. And I know that because I worked the first about 8 years in Brooklyn. And then when I was lucky enough to get to Manhattan, I said, I'm never going back to any place but Manhattan. And Truck One was it for me when it came. And, you know, E-men are unbelievable. They're a breed of their own anyway. Yeah. The best of the best. But Truck One I have a little affinity for.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why. There's other reasons too, but that's part of the reason why Truck One's the Hollywood truck. Because of that television. That's right. Yeah, it
well, you know what happened? Listen, people won't admit this to you. Nobody in police headquarters will tell you this, but you know, for me, the statute of limitations is over. Nobody cares really about anything unless it happens south of 59th Street in Manhattan. That's what's important in New York City. Everything else, not that it's unimportant, but it's just secondary. What happens south of 59th Street is what the world is really all about.
Yeah, I mean, again, look at the press attention. If somebody stubs their toe in Central Park, it's all over the news.
Yeah.
You know, that's just the way it is. And that's what makes that job so unique, especially if you're working in a place like Truck One. If you're working, even though it's a citywide unit, let's say a unit like the Bomb Squad, which is based in Manhattan. You know, right. It's definitely a world in and of itself. I'll continue talking about your acting career in a moment, but I did want to touch on Narcotics, as I mentioned. And that is not an easy world to work in because it feels like it never stops. When you take down one guy, the next guy sprouts up. And you're trying to keep track with these operations, both from a procedural standpoint, units like SNU, building cases, of course, as you were doing, undercover operations on top of that. And on top of this, in the 80s, there was, of course, the crack era, which really affected Los Angeles, really affected New York City. So in regards to that, I don't know if were you undercover in some of these operations, or were you directing cops who were going undercover?
Well, I ran the undercover program. I was never technically an undercover. The only undercover thing I ever did in Manhattan South, we used to buy loose joints down on Wall Street. But, you know, anybody could do that. So I was never an undercover, but I did run the undercover program for the Narcotics Division when I was part of the Special Projects Unit. But even they changed the focus before SNU and SNAP and all these other programs. When I went into narcotics, I think I mentioned earlier there were 75 cops in Manhattan South Narcotics. But we didn't do a lot of buy and bust. There was one team in the whole office that did what was called buy and bust. The rest of the team did actual narcotics investigation. Now, the first buy that I ever covered assigned to Manhattan South Narcotics took place in Connecticut. That's the way it was. We would go wherever it was. And when I tell cops, if I speak to a cop in narcotics today, and I tell them I was a cop in narcotics for 2 years in Manhattan South before I became a sergeant, and I would say, how many arrests do you think I made? And they'd say, oh, I don't know, 200, 300, 400. I said, two. Because back then we were doing investigations. And investigations took time. And of course, the end of the investigation would be hopefully a big score and, a good collar. But when they got into the numbers business, I don't know if it helped. It certainly was better publicity-wise, and maybe the city or the people in the city thought that it was more effective than actually going after the people that were moving the drugs and distributing the drugs. But I didn't do too much of that.
Long-term case building is important, though, because you really, and it's tough when you see these people dealing the poison, sometimes committing murder in certain instances to further their business. But it's all going, not that those crimes don't matter, they certainly do. Not that you guys don't care, you certainly do. But you have to have that patience to build that case. That way, once you nail them, there's no getting out of that. They go down. If they want to flip to get a more convenient deal from the government, other people go down with them. So there's a good end game to it, but it's an exercise in patience, which I'm sure, at least early on, had to be tough.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the crack epidemic. I was right in the middle of all of that. As part of the special projects unit, we were involved in the development and the training for crack and all of that. The police department sent me to Australia. I talked about crack to the police down there. And one of the things when they were writing the laws, and this is how perspective changes. When they wrote the crack laws, they made the penalties more severe, especially like in the area of schools. And that has done a 180-degree turn where they turned it to be that they were picking on people rather than focusing on the people that were selling near the school. So they wound up having a lot of those cases turned around or tossed out or commuted sentences and things like that. But the intent of that, there was no racism involved. The intent of that was purely to get the bad person that was selling the drugs, man, woman, white, black, Asian, didn't matter. Get them off the street for a long period of time.
Right. I mean, evil knows no color. You're evil, you're evil. You're doing bad things, you're doing bad things. Like I said, that's what it boils down to. And we'll continue with that discussion in a moment. I'll get, of course, further into your career, especially as you ascended to lieutenant, ultimately to captain. But in addition to, of course, starring in True Blue as the 8th Precinct captain for a period of time, one of the other roles that I think was notable for you before Third Watch, which I'll get to, was New York Undercover. New York Undercover is a very underrated cop show, in that it wasn't around too long. It was different. The leads were Michael DiLorenzo and Malik Yoba, so it broke the mold at the time because nobody had seen anything like that. That's right. The last season was different. Unfortunately, Malik was still there, but Michael DiLorenzo had a contract dispute with Dick Wolf, so he had left. But you were there as the chief of detectives. So playing a role on a show like that still so many people that watch the show in real time still love to this day. What was it like being on the set with Malik and some of the characters on that program?
They were great. And the woman who played the lieutenant in that was Lauren Velez. She was also terrific. They were terrific to work with. And for me to come in and, because when in the parts that I play, like if I'm the chief or the boss or whatever, it takes 8 days to shoot an hour episode of television, 8 shooting days. Okay, but a person like me who has a role, even though it's a recurring role or a regular role where you're in every episode, because you're not carrying the show and because you're not working every day. So I would come in and do 1 or 2 days to film the scenes that I was in as the boss. And it was so great because they made you feel so welcome. And then, of course, a lot of them ultimately knew that I was still a cop, and that made it even more fun for them and me as well.
Yeah, Patty Darbanville, I think, had left by that point as well. But she was previously, I know, the lieutenant. But yeah, Lauren Velez, and it's one of those shows that I've watched the reruns over the years. I could see Malik in anything. I could see Lauren Velez in anything. But I'm always going to know Lauren as Detective Nina Moreno. Same thing with Malik. I'm always going to know him as the Detective J.C. Williams. So that was a really, really good show for the time that it existed, and it kind of encapsulated 90s culture perfectly.
And as you mentioned, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike, but that was a Dick Wolf show. So that was before Law and Order and all that. That was the Dick Wolf show.
Yeah, that was a Dick Wolf show on Fox. Thursday nights it would air, 1994 to 1998. Now, I will ask you, in line with that, a year later comes Third Watch, and that's another show. I wish that show was still around because it was so good. What I loved about it is it got both. It got the police side, it got the fire side too. And you had some guys on that show as side actors, including, well, you had a main role, but there were side actors on that show that in real life were cops and firemen. Rod Gillis was an ESU sergeant who had a couple of small parts in that show, and he gave his life heroically on 9/11. So I'll ask you, playing Lieutenant Swirsky, before we even get to his character, tell me about just auditioning for that role and getting that role, because even though you had an advantage with your background, it's still not a given you're going to get it.
Well, that's quite a story, because believe it or not, I went in to audition 7 times for Third Watch. I went in and auditioned for 7 roles, including Lieutenant Johnson, who was the fire lieutenant, played wonderfully by an actor named John Michael Bolger. So I went in 7 times. So finally, the last time I go in, it's John Wells and I forgot. I'm getting old. I'm forgetting the other guy. So I go in and I audition, right? And I read the thing, and I think I did a pretty good job. You know, when they say, "Great, Joe, great," they always say, "Great, great, great, great." Okay, thank you. And I get up and I walk. And I get halfway out of the room and I turn around and I walk back and I sit down and say, "Well, I want to tell you guys something." And I had a bag with me and I took the bag out and it had my shield, my real shield, and my decorations. And I said, "You see these? I earned these. This is not BS, okay?" So that's all I wanted you guys to know. And I put them back and I left and they cast me as lieutenant.
Well, let's go back a second. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, go figure, right? 7 times I went in, 7 times. But, you know, my agent we always talked about this. My agent never told anybody that I was a cop, because it could work for you or it could work against you, depending on whoever you were auditioning for. So we always felt it was better never to say anything. But ultimately, in that case, I just had it. You know, and they were so good to me on Third Watch. They changed the shooting schedule when I was doing a play in London, and it was unbelievable the way they treated me. But I did go in for 7 different roles on that show.
And ultimately, you got that one. And again, that's one of those roles that I'm sure people can't picture you as anything else. And again, I don't know if I believe the show is on Peacock. I hope it's on Peacock. Because it'd be great to go back and rewatch. I know they just put Homicide: Life on the Street in its entirety on Peacock, but I got to see if they did that for Third Watch as well, because that was a program they took off the air way too soon. It was so good.
It was politics. I hate to tell you this. It was a good show. The problem was NBC didn't own any of the shows. Really? John Wells and Warner Brothers owned the show. Okay, So we were in a 9 o'clock. Our last season, we were in a 9 o'clock time slot on Friday night, a big time slot. Mm-hmm. And they wanted it for an NBC show because they'd make more money off it. You can't blame them. That's their job to make money.
Yeah.
So that's why it wasn't because of the numbers. We were doing very good numbers when the show was canceled.
Yeah. And I felt like that kind of helps the legacy of the show in a sense that it went out on top. It went out leaving people wanting more.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, another time capsule, because it started in 1999, pre 9/11. Went through that era into 2005, a kind of a snapshot of late 90s into early 2000s, post 9/11 New York City. Again, if you haven't watched it, it's a very, very good show. It holds up really well. S76 Mike was on the job. He says, a good portion of Third Watch was filmed in the 9/4. Got to meet that cast multiple times while on patrol. Short-lived, way too short-lived, I agree with that, but a great show.
Well, one of the reasons, I'm sorry, Mike. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why Third Watch is such a great show is because it was created by and written by a guy named Ed Venero. And Ed Venero had been a cop in Chicago. That's why the show is called Third Watch and not Third Platoon, because in New York City we have the platoon system. But that's how it got the name Third Watch. But he was a cop himself, much like what happens when you get old. the guy from Law and Order,
Dennis Farina.
Dennis Farina, another
Yeah.
guy, a Chicago cop. Another wonderful guy, by the way, who I knew fairly well before. He left us way too early.
He did, yeah. He was great. Joe Fontana, Detective Fontana. And let me tell you, he didn't have an easy time of it, and that's not his fault, because he had to replace Jerry Orbach. And that was going to be tough for anybody, because Jerry Orbach played Detective Briscoe so well. Everybody loved him. Unfortunately, Jerry was really sick and dying of prostate cancer at the time. So, but even though he was only on the show a couple of seasons, he came in under some tough circumstances, and he made it work. I love Detective Fontana. He was great.
I have a great Jerry Orbach story if you want to hear it.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I get hired to do Law and Order, and I'm playing an attorney. And in this, I got a scene with Jerry Orbach that I'm going to cross-examine him on the stand, and it's a 4-page scene. Now, to people who are not actors, they may not understand that a 4-page scene is a very long scene. So I get the scene about, a week before I was going to shoot it, and I'm studying and learning the lines and all that. And I learned the line. Now, comes time to shoot the scene. We get into the courthouse, and they finish another scene that they're filming, and Jerry comes in, and I had met him. I'd worked with him before. He's a wonderful guy. And he says, "Okay, give me the sides." Now, the sides are a small mimeograph section of the scene that the actor can carry in the pocket to refer to when they work. Jerry takes the scene. He goes like this: page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. He says, "Okay, let's go." He'd never looked at the scene before. I studied it for a week. Mike, he didn't miss a word. He knew that whole scene like he lived it unbelievably. It was so good and so real. That's a true testament to a real pro. Jerry Orbach, may he rest in peace. He was the best.
Thank you for sharing that story. And he was a Broadway guy, too. He was a legend on Broadway.
Oh, you had to hear him sing.
Yeah.
I remember when I saw 42nd Street. I'm saying, Jerry Orbach, this guy's a singer. I didn't know that. And he belts out this song, Forget It. And he was a guy from the Bronx. He was just a guy from the Bronx. But he was terrific.
Now, the episode you're talking about, because I feel like I'm a huge Law and Order fan. All three shows, not just the original, although I prefer the original. I love SVU as well, the earlier seasons, and Criminal Intent. Was this the corruption episode from season 7, where one of his old partners accuses him of being on the take?
Yeah, it was the corruption episode.
Yep, and that was 1996.
Yeah. By the way, they call that, just so you know, when you're talking to any Law and Order thing, the show you're referring to is referred in the business as the mothership, because it's the original Law and Order. Then, of course, came SVU and then Criminal Intent. And I was lucky enough to work in those shows too.
Yeah, as is documented, of course, in your career. That's for those of you that haven't seen that episode in a while or don't really watch Law and Order too much. Great episode from season 7. It was shot in late 1996. One of Lenny's old partners accuses him of being on the take, and him and Ray Curtis, his partner at the time, portrayed by Ben Bratt, have to make sure that they help clear Briscoe's name. So really great episode from really a sweet spot in that show's history. Now, getting back to your career on the police side, the commendations that you mentioned earlier during your audition, 2 awards for police commendation, to be exact. Meritorious Police Duty, got that 4 times. Excellent Police Duty, got that 14 times. And that was part of the credibility, ultimately, that was needed to be the CO of the 1-7. Now, for those that may not be familiar where the 17th is, give me the location of the 17th and how much of a joy that assignment was, because I'm sure you had a lot of great cops working under you.
I did. Okay, so 17th Precinct goes on. It's on the east side of Manhattan. It starts at 30th Street. It ends at 59th Street. It goes from the East River to Lexington Avenue and in some places to Madison Avenue. Now, it is, among other things, it encompasses the UN complex, and it's called the fashionable East Side. It's one of the richest congressional districts in the United States. If you go 2 miles north to the South Bronx, that's one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. So there's a dichotomy there. The cops I worked with were outstanding. It wasn't a big precinct. There were less than 200 cops there, if I remember correctly. But I had really first-rate officers there working for me. But I used to tell them, we're all in show business. You know, if you look good and your equipment is good and your cars are clean, that's half the battle. And I used to encourage them to get out and talk to people. I said, because you're never going to know when these people, you're going to need them and they'll be there for you. So I was so happy that I was there, but I hated getting out of Sonny because I was already working as an actor. In 1989, I was a captain in the Narcotics division, and I was playing captain in True Blue, that NBC show. So I had a full-time job as a captain, and I also was working as a captain. And the ironic thing, the irony of life is that in one day as a captain on television, I made more money than all week as a real captain.
Even with the overtime?
Captains don't get overtime.
Really?
We didn't get paid overtime. But I will say this, every day as a captain, when I had the 17th precinct, a minimum you worked was 12 hours a day. Forget it. There's no, even though your tour was 8 hours long, you were always in early and you're always there late, because that's just the way that it was. So, as when I was a lieutenant, when I made sergeant, when I made captain, they didn't send me out to patrol because I had such an important, this is their position, not mine, but I had such an important job in the police department with being the head of the special projects unit. They kept me there. Okay? So then one day I get a call from the lieutenant who was the aide to the chief of the department, who at that time was Robert Johnston. And the lieutenant says, get up here, the chief wants to see you. So I go up to the chief's office. Now, keep this in mind. I'm a captain in narcotics. I have a car from Sterling Johnson from the Special Narcotics Prosecutor's Office, what they call a Category 1 car that I can take home. It's like a big deal. And I make my own hours. If I get a movie or something, I can take the time off to do the work, and I'm good. So I go up to see the chief of the department, and he says, Ray Kelly must like you because we're going to give you a precinct. You're going to become the CEO of the 17th precinct. Now, I was honored, but it was like taking a knife and sticking it in my heart, because how am I going to do this? How am I going to take on the responsibilities of a precinct and try to be an actor at the same time? But of course I said, yes, okay, chief, I'm so happy, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I go to the 17th precinct. Now, when I get the job, the first thing I do, I got to report into the borough commander, who's the 2-star chief. His name was Walsh at the time. Now, the politics of the police department being as they are, a borough commander wants to take care of the people that work for him. Now, 17th precinct is what they call a promotable commander. They usually put people in there that are going to get promoted to deputy inspector. So instead of him picking the guy to go into the 17th precinct, this I don't know person from headquarters, me, gets sent there. So they tell me to report to the chief's office. I sit there. He makes me wait for 45 minutes. And I'm sitting outside, and I'm waving, twiddling my thumbs, waiting to see the chief. I go into the chief's office. He says, sit down. He says, I just want to tell you one thing. He said, I didn't ask for you to be here, and I didn't even want you here. But now that you're here, I'm going to deal with you. Now, that's interesting because it reminded me of my drill instructor, New Yorkers, Italians, reservists. So I said to him, Chief, with all due respect, I didn't ask to come here, and I didn't want to come here. But now that I am here, I'm going to try to be the best commanding officer that you have. Okay. So I went on. Now, when I had that little talk with the big chief, the chief of the department, he told me that Kelly was giving me this job. He said, I know you're an actor, and I know sometimes you need time off. He says, if you ever run into a problem, let me know about it. I'll take care of it. Now, Chief Walsh was a good guy, but he had his own rules, which weren't necessarily aligned with the department rules. And one of his rules was that a precinct commander was not allowed to take more than 2 weeks vacation at a time. Now, I don't know if you know, Mike, but we get like 5 weeks vacation. So I'm in the precinct, I don't know, almost 2 years at the time, and I get a partner movie. I'm on vacation. and I get a part in the movie, and I got to go to Pittsburgh to do the movie, and I'm going to work in this movie for 3 weeks, which means I'm going to have my 2 weeks vacation, and then I need another 3 weeks off. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I called my inspector, a wonderful guy. He just passed away this year, Inspector Batista, Billy Batista. And I said, look, I got to go see the chief. I have to ask him for extra time off. I said, now I know he doesn't like surprises, so I want you to tell him why I'm coming to see him, and I need the time off. I said, because if he doesn't give me the time off, I have to retire because I can't afford to pass up this job. I'm making a nice payday. So he says, okay, well, I'll tell him and I'll call you back. So I'm waiting in the afternoon. I'm supposed to go down and see the chief. So he calls me at 1 o'clock. I'm supposed to see the chief at 3 o'clock. I said, well, what did the chief say? He tells me, well, the chief said maybe he'll give it to you and maybe he won't. I said, Inspector, that's not good enough. I can't do that. I gotta have it. He said, what can I tell you? I said, okay. So I had to call the big chief in the department because he told me if I ever had a problem to call him. So I talked to the lieutenant. I said, I need to speak to Chief. Tell Chief Johnson I need to talk to him. He says, what? And I told him, look, I got this opportunity, boss. I need 3 weeks extra vacation. Otherwise, I have to retire. So he screams on the telephone, get Chief Walsh on the phone. He's talking to his people out front. So he says he hangs up on me. Next thing I know, the inspector calls me back. And he said, Chief Walsh said, take as much time off as you want. And just come back whenever you want to come back. I said, okay. Now, I go to Pittsburgh. I do the movie. It was a great movie. I worked with Tony Danza and Frank Vincent, a bunch of real good guys. It was about the murder of a DEA agent, Gus Faraci, who, by chance, I knew when I was in Narcotics. So I knew the whole story. So I do the job. I come back. And back then, a precinct commander got 3 duties a month. As the duty captain, you're responsible for all the operations during that day. So normally they gave you 3-day duties during the month. The first month I came back, Chief Walsh gave me 17 duties, where I'd be working my job, then I'd have to come back and do a late tour, and then I'd have to do a 4 to 12. So I had to do like 17 extra tours in that one particular month. But it all worked out because I did the job, I got the movie, and I was very lucky.
And that's a credit to Chief Johnson, who's still around, by the way. He's in his early 90s now. But, yeah. I mean, it takes a lot. And that's when you look out for guys. Look, that was over 30 years ago. You've never forgotten it. So it goes to show when someone looks out for you, it goes a long way. People don't forget that.
He was a very good guy, and he was very supportive of the cops. And one day I was a duty captain down in the 9th Precinct. They found mustard gas, a canister from World War I. So I had the duty, and they tell me Chief Johnston's on his way down there. So I said, oh, okay, I got to get down there before the chief because you're the duty captain. You better be there before the chief. So I shoot down there. I get all the intelligence. I have all the reports, what happened, who's got it, what's the disposition, everything. It was freaking cold. I'm waiting outside. The chief's car pulled up. This was before SUVs. They drove the chief in like a big black Ford. So the car comes up and the window goes down this much, and I see the finger going like this. And it's Chief Johnson. Get in the back of the car. So I get in the back of the car. It's rainy, snowy. It's not a nice day. He turns around and I'm ready to tell him about the mustard gas we found. He says, "Joe, I saw you on the show last night. You were absolutely terrific. You really did a good job. I was so happy." He didn't even care about the mustard gas. He wanted to tell me that he had seen me on television. So that's a good man. He was a good guy. Very
good guy indeed. Ultimately, just the last note on the 17th, I think the UN is in the confines of that precinct too, right?
It is. Yeah, it is. Yeah. And it's dealing with the diplomats is another education in and of itself. Because they, as you know, they have diplomatic immunity and they take full advantage of that.
Oh, yes.
I spent many times in the diplomat dining room and the diplomat lounge, which is in the UN complex themselves, and it was quite an experience.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the first instance I heard of that, I don't know if you had him when he was there, but Sal Formica, who later went on to Seven Truck Emergency Service and finished out his career there. That's where he started his career in about 1990 or so. So
Yep,
he was
Sal
mentioning.
He worked with me. He's a wonderful guy, terrific chef. I went to his restaurant on Long Island. He's another E-man, a wonderful guy. He's got a great family, and he's a good example of the cops that I had, that I was lucky enough to work with in the 17th precinct. These are guys, and men and women, by the way. I had terrific female supervisors in the 17th and in narcotics, by the way. And Sal was he's emblematic of the terrific cops that worked in the 17th precinct. These were cops that knew how to get the job done, knew how to take care of the people that they were there to protect, but also knew how to protect the department and its reputation. They were trustworthy. They were very, very sharp in how they comported themselves and how they looked. It was fun to go to work there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ken Bowen, another E-man, cop and sergeant in ESU, says, Mike, Joe, great show. Joe, had pleasure of working with you on the 12 to 8s the night of 1983 sergeant's exam with Lieutenant Young. I drove Lieutenant Young and my friend Jimmy Ciccatelli.
I think Jimmy Ciccatelli might have been Chief Ciccatelli's son. So yeah, no, it was great. It was great, and that's an example. You know what the job has to do, because the night of the exam, they have to give all the cops off so they can study the next day. So you have bosses and people who are not taking the test, filling in and doing the regular patrol jobs for the city on that particular tour.
Mm-hmm. I'll get to you retiring in 92 in a moment, but I did want to touch on this. We talked about it briefly off the air. Although your time on the show was brief, you really got to work, with a very talented actor in James Gandolfini, of course. Many roles over the years, an iconic actor of his generation, somebody who really commanded the screen. What was it like to share the screen with him and interact off screen with him? Because everybody describes him as a really wonderful guy.
Well, having been part of The Sopranos, and as you said, I didn't do that many episodes, although my character ran through the whole stream of the show, was probably the best job I had, except for maybe being on Broadway. Because the Third Watch was great, and I was on that show for 5 years, and I love all those people. But there was something special and magical about The Sopranos. And the best thing about it was that there were no egos involved. Jimmy Gandolfini, who was the big star, was just like, he treated an extra who had no lines with the same dignity and respect as he wanted or he got for himself. He was the most kind-hearted, gentle, caring human being that I knew. He was one of the best. A sad thing, my wife and I happened to be in Rome when he died in Rome. We weren't there together. We weren't traveling together, but we happened to be there, and it was shocking. But a lot of people don't know, and a little inside baseball, as that show progressed, they got more and more popular. And in show business, when your show is doing well, everybody gets raises. And there was a point where Jim held out his raise. He wouldn't take a new contract until they elevated all the people that to see him with in all those scenes, all the main characters. So they got a very hefty, well-respected, well-deserved raise. It was because of Jim that they got that raise. Because, the shows work on a budget. They want to make money. But Gandolfini made sure that those people were well taken care of. And when we weren't shooting, and we were just around each other together, it was enormous fun. He didn't take himself too seriously. He was a great guy. We laughed. We told stories. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience to be part of that show. And besides Jim, all those other people, Michael Imperioli, my very dear friend Steve Sharippa, Vinny Pastore, all those guys, Aida Totoro, David Kroll, all those people, wonderful, wonderful people. It was so much fun just to be part of that thing. The little contribution that I made And it goes on forever. It goes on forever. So.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing with Dave is if you watch any interview that he does, he played such a menacing, horrible individual.
David Probel.
Yes, on that show, his character was one of the more scary characters of that program. But if you watch any interview he does in real life, he's one of the nicest guys you'll ever want to find.
He is, and he was one of the finalists for Jimmy's role. He was one of the last few to be considered for Tony Soprano, David Probel. Fortunately for Jim, they gave it to him. But yeah, he was scary. And a couple of the scenes I did on the show they were with David, and he was a very scary guy. But as you said, as scary as he is, in real life, a sweetheart, a wonderful, wonderful guy. And just by chance, I have another friend of mine, David Eigenberg, who I was on Broadway with. He's in Chicago Fire now. He's a Marine like me. And I used to visit him out in L.A., and David Probel's son lived in the house next door in Burbank. So we used to we'd see David now and then. He's a great guy.
Nice. One last note before I get back to, of course, you retiring in 92, then we'll get to the rapid fire. I wanted to go back to Third Watch for a second because, as I mentioned, you guys were doing that show in the city during and after 9/11. So it was an important show. It had an audience amongst the police and fire of the city. Some of the guys that were extras on that show as firemen in real life and as police officers, I mentioned Sergeant Gillis earlier, were killed in line of duty responding to the Trade Center that day when the towers collapsed. Tell me about just doing that show in the aftermath. And there was a really poignant episode where you guys weren't in it at all. It was in their own words. So that 2001-2002 season, what was that like during that time?
Well, actually, I went into the show just after that, so I only got the aftermath of all of that. Mm-hmm. But you thought, like, I know that Molly Price, she married one of the firemen who was on the show, and no, that was so moving because they still talked about it even after they had done that episode, And I think Anthony Lisi, Sergeant Lisi, he was involved in that, or he might have been interviewed for that. So it was a heart-wrenching experience for the cops that played on Third Watch and for the actors who played the cops on Third Watch.
Right. That was definitely an emotional time, and that episode, I wish I could find it. It used to be on YouTube, but they took it down for some reason, I guess copyright reasons. But it'd be nice to see it again. 1992, you leave, and obviously you had a very burgeoning career outside of that as an actor, so I can see why. But it's still not easy to leave because, as every guy tells me, either on the FD side or the PD side, you miss the clowns, you don't miss the circus, but it's the guys and gals you're doing the job with that make it so fun and make it worth it. So there's, I imagine, a little bit of a tug of war, or maybe there wasn't, but tell me about 92 ultimately deciding, for as much as I've loved this, it's time to go.
Well, I didn't make that decision on my own. The medical unit made it for me.
Oh, really?
What happened was I got hurt. And they put me out. I hurt my knee, and I wound up. To this day, I have no ACL in my right knee. So I got hurt at the UN at a demonstration, and ultimately they put me out. But I tell everybody, and I mean this, as much fun as I have as an actor, and I did, fairly well, successfully, if you measure it just by the amount of money I was able to earn as an actor. There's nothing like being on the job. There's just something about it, the camaraderie, the mutual experience that you have with the cops that you work with. Nothing compares to that, no matter what you do. A lot of cops, they go and they become feds afterwards or big-time investigators. They make millions of dollars, but they'll all tell you, it's just not the same. Mm-hmm. So I'm in that camp. It's just not the same.
It's the greatest show on earth, and I always quote Fred Manzanillo, a former guest of this show from my Tales from the Boom Room miniseries. As he said, the NYPD is the show. You have a backstage pass, and you guys are the show all in one. And the things that you see in 25 years, however long it is, whether you're working the FD or the PD, nobody can never take the stories away from you. It's really a one-of-a-kind place to work.
Yeah, you make a difference in people's lives. As you said, FD, PD, it doesn't matter. You really make a difference in many people's lives, and that's a very rewarding thing. So they say like when you leave this earth and you go up to heaven, and St. Peter's there, he lets all the cops and the firemen in because they did their time in purgatory, or even they served their time in hell.
I never heard that line before, but that's definitely one to remember. Joe, this has been amazing. It's now time for the rapid fire. It's 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. I'll ask you this question, although you answered it in part. When did you feel that you could, well, you mentioned, of course, being a Marine helped you with this. When did you feel you could juggle both being a cop and being an actor? And which do you feel was the harder of the two?
It was harder to be an actor.
Which role challenged you the most?
I just did a role in a movie called Day of the Fight, where I played a taxi cab driver interspersed with my character became Joe Pesci, and Joe Pesci and Michael Pitt. That was a little hard. Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting. I have to check that out. Funniest story from your days as an actor on set, and funniest story from your time as a cop.
Okay, when I was a cop, I was working in a detective squad in Brooklyn, and an old lady came into the police station, and she started screaming. She was cursing up a storm, and she said, and I quote, but I'll leave the profanity out. She told the sergeant, "I told this MFer if he went to sleep, I was going to slit his MFing throat. He went to sleep, so I slit his MFing throat." So the sergeant, this is a little old lady. Sergeant looks at me and says, "Talk to the detective." She came over to me. She says, "I told that person, blah, 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 if he went to sleep, I was going to slit his throat. So he went to sleep, I slit his throat." I said, "Where do you live?" He said, 88 Lexington Avenue. This is in Brooklyn. I said, "Let's go." So my partner and I, we were getting ready to go out to eat. We put her in the unmarked car. We drive over to the house. I said, "Give me the keys." He gives me the keys. I said, "Don't move anywhere." This woman's like in her late 70s, early 80s. "Don't move anywhere. Just sit there." I go up the stairs. I put the key in the front door. I'm jiggling the door, trying to get the door open. The door opens. There's a guy standing there with a towel wrapped around his neck. It was her husband.
Oh, God.
She slit his throat, but thank God she didn't cut him deep enough to cut the artery. So back then, this was before domestic violence. So she said, I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" "We got to arrest her." "No, I don't want to arrest her. I don't want to arrest her. She'll be fine. She'll be fine." So we called the ambulance. They came, took him. We went to eat, and that was it.
I think I remember hearing you tell that story on Police Off the Cuff. Some time ago when you were on that show.
Yeah, I probably did.
It's nice to hear it again because I actually, as you're telling it, came back to me, but I'd forgotten about that story. So it's nice to hear you tell that again. It's always some of those old couples, man. They really spin your mind with how they are. But it's a great story to hear. Thank you for telling it. Fourth, you mentioned eating. After a long day of being on the job, where was your favorite spot to stop in for a bite?
Well, in Brooklyn, there wasn't any places to go and stop in to eat. But, I used to get invited. You've heard of Rayo's, of course.
Yes.
And I used to go to Rayo's almost, for a long time, I used to go almost every Monday night with a good friend and a good cop, Sonny Grasso. So even when I was still on the job, he would call me up on Monday and say, "Come on, let's go." So that was my favorite restaurant back then. Probably still is, although I don't go there anymore.
There's 2 cops that they're not around anymore, but I wish I could have talked to them. Had this podcast been around then. He's one of them. The other one's Joe Coffey. But sadly, both those guys have since died.
And I knew both those guys. I knew Joe Coffey, and Frank Darby was another guy who was kind of like a partner. Joe was a sergeant, Frank was a detective, but they kind of worked together. And I don't know if you know, but Joe Coffey had God forgive me, he had a wiretap on the Vatican back in the 70s. Because you don't know this, more inside baseball. They were, I believe they were kind of laundering money or something. But anyway, he had a wire that went into the Vatican. Joe Coffey. Yeah, there you go.
First lady.
And Sonny he was unbelievable. Sonny Grasso, he's the guy that helped me get into SAG, because he was a producer and he got me my SAG card, which started it all.
Man, You know, and I know Joe Coffey is primarily as a mafia investigator. He has so many great stories from that. Of course, he danced with Mrs. Reagan one time as well, but
Yeah.
I never knew that. That's inside baseball for sure. The last question of the rapid fire advice you'd give cops coming on the job now, and this is a two-part question: rookie cops, and also since you were a commanding officer for a long time, advice you'd give new bosses on the job.
Well, I think I told you about being the boss. You got to be tough, but always be fair. The cops respect that. They'll understand it. You can't be a hypocrite. You can't be two-faced. That would be the advice that I would give to a young supervisor. Don't try to be their friends. They want you to be their boss. And your job is to take care of them and protect them.
Well said. This was a heck of a show. Well worth the wait to get you on, my friend. Thank you very much. Stick around. We'll talk off there. Before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything, the floor is yours.
Well, listen, I want to say thank you to you, Mike, for having me on the show. But I want to say, everybody, we need to give a great thanks to all the cops and firemen all over the country, actually all over the world. Because when I was in special projects, I used to entertain cops from all over the world, including the Soviet Union. We had cops from Moscow came to New York, and we would train them too. And one thing that cops know is no matter where you're a cop, the problems, the job is the same all over. What's different from the NYPD is that they do more of it, but it's basically the same job all over the place. So everybody, when you see a cop, you go past the firehouse, say hello to the firefighters. They're standing in the doorway. You see a cop, say good morning, say good afternoon, and that'll go a long way. And don't forget our people in uniform, especially my brother and sister Marines. Hoorah, Semper Fi.
And as Chris Ebden brings up in the chat, our EMS people too. We don't want to forget EMS. I forgot EMS. I'm sorry about that. Much love.
No, we should not forget them. You're right. 100% right. My mea culpa. I apologize.
Sorry, Chris. He was a long-time New York City EMS and briefly FDNY EMS too upon the merger. So shout out to them as well. Thanks to everybody that tuned in, whether you watch tonight on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Facebook. And again, please continue to keep Miles' son's family in your prayers as they grieve his loss. And, a shout out to Miles. He was a wonderful guy and a wonderful friend. Great to know. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, we got one show left for the year, then we're done for the year. Working on this one for a long time. It'll finally come to fruition. In the FDNY for 25 years, 79 to 04. In FEMA for a long time, too. So he wore two hats between the federal side, emergency response, and, of course, the fire side in New York City. Former FDNY Battalion Chief Phil Parr will be here for volume 65 this Monday for the last show of the year. Of the best and bravest interviews with the FDNY. So looking forward to that. Again, this Monday, 6 p.m., Phil Parr, retired FDNY Battalion Chief. Now, for those of you listening on the audio side tonight, for tonight's outro song, we once again return to Warren Zevon and his 1989 album Transfer City, as this time he comes your way with Long Arm of the Law. In the meantime, on behalf of retired NYPD captain and actor Joe Lisi, I am Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend. Please be safe.